Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Gold Star Examples of Researchers who are broadening participation in STEM through impactful education and outreach. I apologize for the noise behind me. Hope you can hear me. This event is sponsored by the Coalition for Education and Outreach, also known as CEO. CEO is a community of practice that brings together science educators, researchers, and education and outreach practitioners working at Berkeley, as well as in schools and other off-campus partner organizations throughout the Bay Area. My name is Kate Spohr, and I work at the Berkeley Research Development Office. I also serve as co-chair of CEO along with Lale Cote. As a reminder, this session is being recorded, so those who can't join us today can view the video later. We've muted all of you to minimize noise, except for me, but your cameras are enabled, and we ask that you turn them on as much as possible so that the speakers can see your faces. We warmly welcome your questions, and we invite you to submit questions at any time into the chat window. You can enable the chat function by clicking on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. We may not get to every question, but we'll do our best, and we will try to select questions that reflect common themes. I'm joined today by co-host Faith Dukes, who is the K-12 STEM Program Director at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and Dion Rossiter, who is the Director of Science at Cal. And to get us started, I'm going to turn things over to Faith.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today in what we hope is a great discussion around broadening participation within STEM. Today's session thinks about how we as a STEM community can broaden that participation, because while the US continues to become a more diverse nation, STEM continues to be exclusive to historically minoritized groups, leading to a loss of talent and perpetuating systems of class and oppression. Broadening participation within STEM is more critical than ever. And today you will hear from 3 outstanding researchers, all at different levels of their careers and with varied disciplines, who have successfully planned, executed, and sustained broadening participation activities into their careers as scientists. Our speakers are Deb Argawal, Senior Scientist and Data Science and Technology Department Head at Berkeley Lab, Kwabina Beriako, Assistant Professor of the Department of Chemistry at UC Berkeley, and Ron Cohen, Professor in the Department of Chemistry and Department of Earth and Planetary Science at UC Berkeley. The panelists will now give introductions of themselves, talking about their research and the ways in which they are broadening participation within their own laboratories. Following that panel, we will have a moderated discussion by Dee Rossiter, and then we will have an audience Q&A. Again, we welcome you to put your questions in the chat box. We'll be collecting them as the session goes on and try to get to almost all of them if we can. Now I'll pass it over to Dee Rossiter.
Hi, sure. Thanks, everyone. So why don't we start with Deb? How about that? Dr. Deb Argawal is a senior scientist and the Data Science and Technology Department Head at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Dr. Argawal's current research focuses on developing computational tools to enable scientists to more effectively organize and use their data to address challenges. 2 of her current major projects include data repository for earth science data and a water treatment innovation project called NAWI. She has worked on projects involving watershed understanding, tropical forests, soil carbon, carbon capture, cosmology, particle accelerators, and satellite data. So basically nothing at all. Deb has been involved in and led diversity efforts throughout her career at LBNL and co-leads career mentoring workshops as a member of the Computing Research Association Committee on Widening Participation. Deb earned her BS in mechanical engineering from Purdue University. Her MS and PhDs are from UC Santa Barbara in computer engineering. So go ahead and take it away and let us know a little bit more about you. Classic.
I think you already told everything about
I know,
me.
I was just gonna say that's a lot.
I think I only So I think since you've already heard a lot about my research, I started out as a mechanical engineer. I moved to computing. So I was used to, from an early period, being very much in the minority just as a woman. Within mechanical engineering, we were at best 10%. I think we still are. And it hasn't changed much in my entire career. Then in computing, it's been back and forth, but it's not that dissimilar. So as part of my research career, actually diversity has always been part of my research career because not because I thought it was important at first, but during my PhD, my advisor convinced me to go to a conference that was all for women. It was called Grace Hopper. It had never been held before. It was the first time. And she said, well, go. I said, no way. I don't need to go to something like that. I know how to succeed as a woman. I don't need to hear from a bunch of other women. And she said, go anyway. I said, okay, fine. And I went, and it was just such a fun experience to meet so many women that were succeeding in their careers and could be role models, that I had never seen that before. And so it was really cool to see that. And it got me excited about starting to do diversity. So throughout my career, I've woven it in. I've done everything from continuing to attend that Grace Hopper conference and be involved in it, to forming a diversity working group within my area, within the lab, to work on things somewhat locally. The lab had a diversity working group, but it didn't really seem to impact our people. And so we started our own working group to actually start to look at impact there. I've also been a panelist at a lot of diversity events, and the CRAW effort that Dee mentioned, this Computing Research Association, has been sort of a center point of a lot of my diversity work. That is looking across the whole research area of computing research, across industry, the academics and the national labs, and trying to increase diversity through mentoring workshops. We just had grad cohort, which brings the second and third year graduate students, and I help run the early career and mid-career workshops that we run, that bring together people from across the country, across the spectrum of those three areas. That's been really rewarding and sort of been my touchstone in diversity work. And out of that, we've run a mentoring program, and we really focus also on building the group into a diverse working group within my research group. And we do find that really enhances our research and our ability to do the research. So I think I'm going to stop there, since I think in the panel questions we'll go into a lot of the rest of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think we'll get much more specific as we move around. So our the next person we're going to introduce is Professor Kwabina Beriako. He was born in Ghana, West Africa. He moved to the US in 2004 for his undergraduate studies in chemistry at Calvin College, graduating with honors in 2008. After a year of working at UOP Honeywell in Illinois, he traveled from the Midwest to the East Coast to begin his graduate studies in inorganic chemistry with Professor Daniel Nocera at MIT. He can correct me if I pronounce that wrong, and later at Harvard University. His graduate research focused on new materials for renewable energy storage. And after receiving his PhD in 2015 from Harvard, Kwabina began his postdoctoral work with Professor Philip Kim's group in the Department of Physics at Harvard, where his research explored the manipulation of the physical and chemical behavior of ultra-thin materials that may be used in next generation batteries. In July 2018, Kwabina joined the faculty at UC Berkeley, Department of Chemistry, and his research group explores new materials and methods for energy conversion and low power electronic devices. So it sounds like, Kwabina, you've been all over the country, probably more so than even Americans themselves, Midwest, East Coast, West Coast, you've seen it all. So thank you for being here so much. We appreciate your time. So would you like to go ahead and get started?
Sure thing. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and this chance to talk to you all. Yeah, I mean, following Deb it's tough. Like, what can I say? Yeah, so you heard a little bit about sort of my background. So I grew up in Ghana, which is in West Africa. Throughout high school, came here to the U.S. for college, and yeah, and sort of ping-ponged around from the Midwest, the East Coast, and out the West Coast. So yeah, I actually hadn't. I think I'd only visited California like a couple times before I accepted the position at Berkeley. So yeah, but really enjoying it a lot so far. So yeah, and you heard a little bit about what my research group is doing. So in my PhD work, I was most focused on energy conversion. So, ultimately, how do we take renewable energy sources like solar or wind and store them in some form, ideally in the form of a fuel. And so that fuel may, originate from taking CO2 in the atmosphere and making a liquid fuel like methanol or ethanol, and sort of a artificial photosynthesis, as it's often called. And then in my, having done that for, 5.5 years, maybe, my postdoctoral research sort of focused instead on physics of materials and sort of another side of, you could say, the energy problem, the renewable energy problem, which is how do we design materials that conserve electricity. So sort of fun fact, the amount of CO2 that we release into the atmosphere from electronic communication information technology is, exceeds that of the aviation industry. So that's clearly a big problem. And so that sort of the problem that motivates my research group right now is sort of these two sides of energy conversion, energy conservation. So anyway, I can talk more about that if you want to know about the sorts of things that we work with, but anyway, that's the motivation. For broadening participation, obviously I'm sort of fairly early on in my career. I feel like I'm here to more learn from everybody else in the audience and some of the other panelists, actually, than to share any wisdom or experience that I don't have. But I've found myself fairly fortunate to be involved in a few programs that have really shaped me for the course of my graduate studies and my postdoctoral work, and now in the 2-3 years or so that I've been at Berkeley. And some of the most enriching experiences for me have involved being able to interact with the general public. So this could, and also young students. So this could be elementary school kids or high schoolers, and trying to sort of convey my excitement for science and hopefully, perhaps show them a picture, if you will, of what a scientist looks like that maybe they haven't seen too often. But one of the things, we'll talk about this, I guess, later on. One of the things I've found that's really important is that as scientists, we learn how to communicate in a way that is accessible to a broad audience. I think oftentimes we don't do that too well, and we need to be coached in that a little bit. And so I think, yeah, anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But so it's sort of those opportunities to sort of participate in the community, in outreach efforts to elementary, high school folks I found really enriching. And then as a postdoc, I was fortunate to be involved in a program funded by the NSF that had as a key component of that program a collaboration with the Museum of Science in Boston. And I learned a ton from that program, not the least of which was sort of how to communicate, a little bit better, hopefully, to broad audience. But I think that was able to reach a lot of people through exhibitions, through public talks on sort of the science that we were doing in that NSF funded center. Let's see. Yeah, so here at Berkeley, I'm really excited to to plug in and get involved in outreach opportunities. And so we've started trying to make some inroads there, a little bit interrupted by COVID, but hoping to get more involved. And so I'm looking forward to hearing about all, some of the opportunities that are out there and connecting with folks who are sort of on the ground, really doing some of that great work, and see where we can plug in. Anyway, that's my spiel.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, so our last panelist is Professor Ron Cohen. He's a professor of atmospheric chemistry at UC Berkeley. Obviously, we know that. He was director of the Berkeley Atmospheric Science Center from 2006 to 2016. Cohen is known for his work on the atmospheric nitrogen cycle, the temperature dependence of ozone and urban emissions of greenhouse gases. And he is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Geophysical Union. Cohen is a co-author of over 280 peer-reviewed scientific publications, and he has mentored over 50 PhD students and postdoctoral fellows and over 50 undergraduates in their research. His Beacon project is a hub for education and outreach to underrepresented K through 12 students. And Ron is near and dear to my heart because I worked in Ron's lab for either a semester or a year. I can't remember because it was a blur, because it was in 2005 when I was a wee little undergrad at UC Berkeley in Earth and Planetary Sciences. So it's nice to have Ron here for that reason, because he has been influential in my life as well. So I have to thank Ron for being here also, and take it away, Ron.
Thanks, Dee. It's great to get to work with you again. So where should I start? So I think that you heard that our research is on air quality and climate related issues at the opposite end of that spectrum from Kwabina. We're trying to describe what it is we know about the atmosphere and not trying to solve the problem per se with new technologies that reduce CO2 emissions. And that's, I put in the chat a link to our website, one of the projects we have, and that's forming the basis for a lot of our education and outreach, is called Beacon, and it's a project to map air quality and CO2 emissions. I was reminded listening to Deb of the enormous transition that's happened for women in my field since I started. When I came to Berkeley, there were about 0 women who worked in making measurements in the field in atmospheric science. There were a ton of people who had done that as graduate students and then found their way into modeling and other aspects of atmospheric science where they didn't have to go out with their instruments and do things. And that's completely and totally changed in the 20 odd years I've been here, 20 plus. That there are now lots and lots of women who are leading figures in observational atmospheric science, and that wasn't the case. And I'd like to think I contributed a little bit to that with students from Berkeley. It's because Berkeley is really such an enormous incubator for talent. And we have the just really fabulous ways of creating and producing new leaders in all kinds of places. So in that vein specifically, when I was vice chair for admissions in our department, in the chemistry department, we were that was the first year that we, in the physical chemistry side, which is probably more analogous to the engineering disciplines that Deb described than the biological disciplines. That was the first year we admitted 50-50 men and women. So that was an important thing that I contributed to. And then I'll just say, because of the work we do, although I always think of myself as a curiosity-driven scientist, and why I do this is because I want to know how the world works. There's lots of people who want to understand what we're doing because they care about the air they breathe, and they care about their health, or they're policy people who care about what the right policy to make is. And so much more than I ever imagined as a graduate student or a postdoc, I feel this sense of obligation to translate what we're doing into language that's consumable by the general public and people, and to use that opportunity as a vehicle in training people in the science that we do. Let me stop there and turn it over back to you, Dee, to push the questions forward.
Yeah, I think that this is a great transition to some of these questions are a lot more specific about how do you even, how do you become who you are, and how do you integrate the work that you're doing into your research and into your labs? Because I think either there's early career researchers, we have all different types of people who are joining us, early career researchers to programmatic folks to, students. And the first question is, and I'll just shoot it right back to you, Ron, and we can go down the line. How do you sustain your broadening participation activities? So through grants, partnerships, existing campus community resources, all those things that are required to actually create and sustain these sorts of activities. So how have you done that?
So I think the starting point for that is really that I've created a system in my group where key ideas are transmitted from one student to the next. And I was thinking about this question in the outline of things you sent. I think one of the things that, as I looked back on what we were doing to talk today, is that there's a lesson plan that a student of mine created in something like 2002 or 2003 for talking to third grade classrooms about clouds. And we still use that. And my PhD students are still putting together the hands-on experiments that we ask third graders to do. And it's changed and morphed. It's been reimagined by lots of different students, but it's been passed down for almost 20 years now. And so I think in many ways that's been the as much as sort of my support and encouragement and working with my grad students to make them understand that this is part of what we should be doing as scientists, and we should do it in the right amounts, so that especially for them where they have careers to build, that their career is going to be made by their research publications and not by their third grade classroom teaching. But their third grade classroom teaching comes back and helps them speak more confidently in public in other ways and serves them well. And so we should be doing that in the right amount. But that's so independent of all the other intermediate things, like a grant lasts 3 years, we can do more, we can do less. It's the finding a way to sustain that internal continuity and belief that it's an important part of a PhD education to participate in this way is really, I think, the most important thing we've done in structuring it.
So really taking a focus on sort of capacity building, even within the lab, the activities and the resources and things like that, and maintaining this kind of ideology of this is important and we're going to make space and room for this.
Yeah, and to be honest, if I had to reteach and keep that knowledge all in my head, we would have lost this a long time ago. It's only sustained because I have a great team.
Awesome. Great. What about you, Kwabina? Would you answer this differently?
Not too differently, I guess. Well, yes, because I don't have the, many years of that experience, and but sort of on our end, trying to start some things, trying to begin. I think for me, one of the points that Ron made that resonates with me is the importance of the students or postdocs in the group really feeling sort of like they have a sense of ownership over whatever it is that we're doing out in the community, right? Because it's just not sustainable if it's just, our ideas for, how, for how we're going to have a, viable outreach program. It can't just be my, ideas. Most of my ideas are bad anyway. And then my students figure out how to turn that into something really interesting. So I think what I'm trying to do is to develop an ethos in the group where these projects that might otherwise be seen as a departure perhaps from what they're going to get my students are going to get their PhD on, for them to sort of appreciate that, just as Ron said, learning to give a talk to a broad audience helps you to become a better scientific speaker as well. And that's something I've certainly seen in my own experience throughout graduate school and my postdoc. And so that's something I'd like to sort of to transmit to my students as well. And then also giving room to the students for whom outreach or other sorts of educational activities are very, very important to them for one reason or another, and giving them the space to sort of explore that side, that creativity. I don't have too much to add on this. Apart from that, maybe in 20 years, I might have, something a bit more to add. But
yeah. And from a personal standpoint, I have to say, as even within graduate school, I was so grateful that my advisor gave me that space that you're saying, giving people the kind of the ownership over these programs that are a little outside of the, normal space that people think of a scientist doing their scientific research. So also grateful for faculty who do that, who allow for that. Deb, how about you? I know things are different too, because you're at the lab. So in terms of sustaining the goals and activities for broadening participation, how would you say that you've been able to do that?
So it's pretty similar to what Ron and Kwabina said. So I think the main things I have to add, since we don't have students, we do try and do the same things. But one thing that was really important for me was also getting my management on board from the beginning, so that they were supportive, so that they were willing to send the notes, so that they were willing to provide funding when needed and things like that, and so that it was valued within the organization, because you can do things as skunk works, where you just do it and you don't tell anybody else up in the whole system, but it's much harder to sustain that way, because at some point you get swamped and you say, I could quit any time and no one will notice. Right? Whereas if you really make it part of the organization, it helps spread it, and it helps also to make sure that you sort of have people rooting you on and other, and things like that. And similar to the student story, the other key element really is building that team, and having that you have a team of people who are invested in the ideas and in doing these things together. Because that really makes it also quite sustainable, because you can. And then, you also kind of hinted at that you wanted to hear how we did this funding wise. In terms of within the lab, by getting my management involved, I was able to get funding to be able to do the training, do some of these extra pieces, pay for buses from the local high school to bring kids up to the lab. I mean, doing things like that required funds, we were able to do through having brought management on board from the beginning. Within the Computing Research Association piece, we actually have a group of the members of the board actually do fundraising. And we get NSF funds, we get Department of Energy funds, we get nonprofit funds. We do industry sponsorships for some of the workshops. So it's a variety of different things that we cobble together as the sources for the funding for these, because professionals that are from groups that are not traditionally represented in these fields don't have as much access to resources to pay for their attendance at meetings like this. and don't even necessarily want to tell their management, you know, oh, I need money to go to this thing that's just for me. So that's been really important, is finding that sustainable funds, and that's a core element of how we do that within the organization.
Yeah, that's great. And if I was dancing around that, I didn't mean to. I want explicitly, how do you find money to do that? Like, I will be as explicit as I need to be. So if even, Ron or Kwabina want to jump in about money, please feel free to.
Sure, I can say I do it in two ways. I think that I have some direct support for some of our education work through NASA. It's a complicated path. It's NASA to the University of Toledo, to an education nonprofit, West Ed, finally to Berkeley. And there we have, that grant pays for direct engagement with green academies and nearby high schools. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I do is the campus has a strategy where you can, as a faculty member, pay yourself and then get that money back as discretionary money. And then I use some of that discretionary money to support the work we do in education and outreach. And Megan Arnett, who's on this call with us, some of her salary comes that way. She leads in my group the education and outreach effort.
Yeah, I guess if early on in one's sort of career, probably much of that is funded through discretionary funding, like your startup, and so until you get maybe some of these other grants that Ron was talking about, or like an NSF career award or NSF awards in general. NSF puts, as many of you would know, puts a significant emphasis on broadening participation and outreach, and so they oftentimes actually want to see in your budget that you're making some space for that, and allocating an appropriate amount for that work. I'm not aware. I don't know if, say, many DOE grants sort of have maybe as strong of an emphasis, or probably not so much DoD. But yeah. So, but probably to begin with, startup funding probably is the way to go until something else comes on. Yeah.
And then it can be integrated into those grants. Great. So what about, and I will now go why don't I start actually just kick it back to you, Kwabina, in terms of a partnership that you've really valued, that you've been involved in, and that, has been successful. Do you want to describe one of those partnerships, or who you've worked with that,
Sure.
You could give a shout out to a group or a process? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. So I think I mentioned this a little bit ago in my brief intro, but the one that when I saw that question, the partnership that stood out to me was one that I experienced when I was a postdoc at Harvard, and I mentioned that my research was being funded by an NSF, what is called NSF STC, Science and Technology Center, but it was but a key component of that NSF Center was a collaboration with the Museum of Science in Boston. And what made that program outstanding, I mean, just on every level. So, okay, the science was great, great collaborators, but the outreach component was simply phenomenal. And one of the parts that stood out to me that I thought would be worth highlighting was the Museum of Science got, a lot of faculty and also students for sure, but a lot of faculty to agree to give some talks on their research. So there were exhibitions at the Museum of Science on, some, fancy, exotic materials that were being studied in the center, but they also got the the faculty to agree to give some talks. And ordinarily that's a terrible idea because scientists can be really, really bad at giving public talks. We're bad enough at giving scientific presentations, but we sort of grin and bear it. But when it comes to then talking to a general audience, it's just excruciating sometimes. And so, but what our collaborators at the Museum of Science in Boston did was they organized a series of workshops on delivering talks to a broad audience. And you actually had, PIs, professors sort of giving a talk, and then folks would sort of critique them and say, no, that part wasn't clear. You should probably do it this way, or, oh, that would, you really need to rework it. So I think it was probably a bit of a humbling experience, but it led to some really, really outstanding presentations that, families could come and, listen to this, person who, maybe in a few years is going to win a Nobel Prize for something they just discovered, and hear them talking about their work at an accessible level. And it was because of sort of this effort and also the willingness of, students, postdocs, faculty to sort of be taught, to be coached on how to deliver a really compelling and engaging public talk, and how to craft that in an exciting way. And that, made it, I think, just a phenomenal activity, and it was a lot of fun. And I think in that process, we also became better, like I mentioned before, better just scientific speakers as well. You just learn a lot from that. So that's one that came to mind. That there's a question in the chat. Should I answer it or
let's just wait until when we get to the Q&A. I think that would work. I'm going to put a plug in right now for Science at Cal lectures and whatever Faith is doing in her K through 12 work, because we coach scientists. Every lecture that you see through Science at Cal has been many hours of coaching has gone into those lectures. So come to us, scientists out there, if you want to learn some public talk techniques. Also, if you're at LBNL, go to Faith as well. Let her know you're interested in giving some talks. So with that, let me turn it over to Deb. What about you, Deb? Do you have a partnership that worked really well, that there's pieces of that partnership that you feel like we should hear about or know about, in case either the scientist or the programming staff on this in this call would like to, could create something similar?
Well, this time it's hard to follow Kwabina.
Yeah,
that sounds like an awesome partnership. I want to be part of that one. In my case, I would say the partnership with the Computing Research Association Widening Participation Committee, because actually I get as much out of it as I put into it, because I mean, these are deans of at schools, they're senior faculty at schools, they're high-ranking people in industry. I mean, the connections I build and the experience I learn from them, from advice, I get as much mentoring out of participating in that as I give out. So that partnership has been huge, and it's an opportunity really to gain a lot in my career and in my research through that connection with them. I think the other really successful partnership, besides the one that Faith mentioned, which I love that I was able to help her program, but for our mentoring program, I explicitly recruited a bunch of the people, the staff folks who I thought would actually be very passionate about the program, and got them invested in the program over the years. And the success thing that I want to mention is I was actually able to reach out to 3 of them and say, hey, I really need to step down from this. So you guys willing to take over? And they've been running it now for about 4 years. And I only had to be involved for the first year because they knew the program, they knew what it meant, they knew how to run it. And they just picked it up, and now they're evolving the program. So for me, that is just, my favorite success story out of doing this is being able to hand off a program and let other people sort of run it forward has been just phenomenal.
Thank you. And Ron?
So I think I'll highlight two things. One, I've had really fabulous relationships with both Bay Area Science, well, two of the Bay Area Science Museums. For a long time, we had a good collaboration with the Chabot Space and Science Center. And then the education director there left and now runs the Center for Jewish Studies on campus. So, so my key relationship there changed to someone I have lunch with now. We're not working as closely with Chabot, but I have a really longstanding relationship at the Exploratorium with Mary Miller. Our observations are on display in the part of the museum they call the Bay Observatory. And it's, most of the Exploratorium is all about hands-on things, and data is not very hands-on. And so the Bay Observatory is a place where they're a little bit more freeform about how you can experience the world in the museum. And so our CO2 observations are there, and along with observations of CO2 in the Bay and measurements of the weather and all kinds of other people's measurements. It's really an interesting spot, and we've been working and trying to collaborate on how to bring our observations to the public in lots of different ways through that collaboration.
Awesome, thank you. The next question, I think we've touched on a little bit, so we can kind of expand on what we said. What we've said throughout the last few minutes, but in what ways has campus programs, central offices, staff, or infrastructure assisted in your broadening participation work, including on the resources and partnerships? I know we already talked about institutional buy-in, for example, startup funds. These are all kind of, either university or lab specific ways in which those that infrastructure exists that can help you with these programs. So Ron, just shooting it right back to you. Do you want to add anything more about how campus?
So, let me start, and let me, Kate has a related question in the chat that I think maybe we should all try and address. So I think that the core way that the campus has helped is in the times when I've tried to scale up significantly. So when we wrote an STC or other big proposals, I've worked with Kate before, and she was our partner in trying to craft a much larger effort in education and outreach in a couple of big center proposals. And so I think, that's where the campus is committed people and resources to trying to make a difference in what we're doing. I think otherwise, pretty much we've sort of, it's been, smaller scale than that and on our own, and not trying to keep the effort at one that I can manage without a larger coordination, because there aren't resources to manage a larger effort. And so trying to figure out what it is I really love to do, and making sure that the work we do is consistent with when I'm having fun. And then I think Kate's question connects to this, and sort of, so what, where in the evaluation of my work and my students' work, where is the university placing value on that and recognizing it? And I think, it's, when I'm up for promotion, it's one of the many things that I write about. I think the university values it, but it values it, I would say, as much as just an expression of culture and our values as anything else. I think we're very much committed to this, but we know that the lifeblood of what we do is the research, and so this should grow from the research, not take over from the research.
That's a great way to phrase that. Kwabina, anything on your end as it relates to kind of the infrastructure that the campus provides? We already got a shout out for Kate. So, or how your department, the question that came in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add to that really. I think
I think I have to say, as an early career researcher, I will point out maybe you have a different perspective too than Ron on this question that came in the chat.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing to say is I think it's clear that our department and Berkeley as a campus values greatly the outreach and education efforts, and so that is clearly something that, as Ron said, it's sort of part of the culture of Berkeley, and so I feel supported, I suppose, at the moment, to the extent that I feel it is an important contribution that I can make, and I do feel like if I that those efforts would be appreciated by the department. I can't put my finger on anything at this time that I'd say, sort of apart from, say, startup funds that are discretionary, that I know I can use them for these kinds of activities. Can't put my finger on anything at the moment that over the last 2 or 3 years I could say, well, this is the way the department has supported. But that's perhaps more because I'm still very early on in any sort of stage of these activities. So yeah, I think it's primarily sort of just the ethos and the culture of Berkeley makes me feel like this is something that would be valued. And so I have the freedom to pursue these things as Ron mentioned, as an outgrowth of the research that we're doing in my group.
Awesome, thank you. And Deb, how about you?
So I hadn't mentioned, but I've been at the lab about 27 years. So I've kind of been through a long period of, because early on in my career, it wasn't that valued by organizations. And so for probably the first 5-10 years, I do things, but it really would be skunk works. Nobody really knew about them other than maybe, occasionally I'd mention something to folks, or people who were affected would know about it. And I would say our organization over the last, 17 years has really grown in its appreciation of the diversity challenge and how much it needs to have specific focus. And we've added, there's a director's award. I got it one of the early years because they took the opportunity to actually recognize all the work that we had been doing. But it is now really woven into our culture, and I think what's been really gratifying is that colleagues that I collaborate with scientifically are actually more interested in collaborating with me because of the diversity work that I do. And so to me, it actually has enhanced my career, because as the institution is flipped, I think the attitudes of folks have kind of come full circle, and actually they're seeking to do more in the diversity space, and actually being someone known as doing some of these things, it's enhanced my collaborations. So I'd say at this point, the institution is so supportive that it actually enhances my scientific reputation in the end, that I do these things. I think the other thing, I don't think it meets any of your questions, but I just want to get in there. Is it another place where this very unexpected, where this diversity effort and my research have really combined, is that I work very interdisciplinary, but I always thought of that the people who needed to be in my core team needed to be the computer scientists. And over time, what we realized is that, computer science is kind of like engineering, where there's a lot of places where women, people of color get scared out of that field and get sort of run out for various reasons. And so those folks are sitting in other fields, but they're perfectly capable. And what we've actually been doing a lot of is, in our interdisciplinary work, finding those early career folks who actually have a real aptitude in this space and want to actually, sort of work on both things. And it's actually really enhanced our ability to do this interdisciplinary work, because there are all this hidden talent sitting in earth sciences or somewhere else where they felt more confident that they could succeed, even though they had the talents to succeed anywhere they wanted to. And they find that they love doing that interdisciplinary work and actually coming back to the some of the things that were their interests early on. So that's another way that it's really enhanced my science, because it's allowed me to have interdisciplinary teams who have really strong experience in both in the end.
I'm really glad that you added that, because I don't know how that would have worked its way in the questions, but that seems like such an important point that actually you're exposing me to something I didn't even think of. Although I know it's a phenomenon in earth sciences too, right, Ron? We had talked about this another time, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people find their way into some field where they're comfortable, and so. Right. I mean, why is it that I'm bringing gender diversity to this panel?
Right.
Another example of that.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So our last canned question has to do with, as we know, I've mentioned that there's both, maybe early career researchers, but also the education practitioners on this call who want to work with faculty, who want to work with the researchers at Berkeley Lab, like somebody like me, like somebody like Faith, right, who are running these educational programs. And so the question is now, what can we do, right? Let's see, how can we better connect with researchers? And I think that this goes into, really, Megan asked that great question earlier. How can we create meaningful, productive, and impactful outreach work with you? What knowledge and resources do you need from folks like the educational practitioners on this call to build a successful program? Because I know that as much as we talked about the successful outreach programs, I know that there are unsuccessful outreach programs, right? So the question is then now, what piece of that pie do folks like us contribute? So that's really where this question is going. So why don't I do the same, where I pop back to Ron, who just talked?
Sure. So I think, here's the question where it comes down to the fact that all of us have a fixed amount of time in our lives. And where we're trying to build, what we're trying to do and how the bandwidth we have to think through how to grow programs and structure them in a way that allows them to grow and to bring in professionals is challenging. So I think that's really the key here, is for you guys as professionals to figure out, where can you grab the expertise of people who are running research labs and help them see how they could scale up what they're doing in a new way. As one example, and you in this room will have a better sense of what the arc of the possible is than we might. I think the other thing is that we don't have a very good way of scaling across faculty or scientists at the lab. There are things that we're all doing that would probably be much more effective if we did them collaboratively in some way. And we could collaborate in this space and it would be different from our research collaborations. And we don't have a collective organized strategy for doing that. We don't have a really good way of thinking about it. We don't have structures that allow people to plug in and say, I can bring this to the team, and I can do it in a way that's small, where I can start small and manageable and the barrier to entry is low. And so I think that there's a place where we could think about, collective action, and there are examples of that, right? So Science at Cal and the public speaking operation that Faith runs, those are examples of places where people can come and plug in with low barriers to entry. but you come and you give your talk and you go away. It's not a sustained engagement. So that's what I would think about is what could we do collaboratively, all the people on this call, to create places where people could come in and plug in and be more effective at scale.
Wonderful. And Kwabina?
Yeah. So once again, from my perspective as starting, I think one of the barriers or challenges for somebody, well, one of them for somebody sort of at my stage is just not even sometimes knowing where to start. Who should I contact if I wanted to be involved, right, in something? And what opportunities are there? Where is there a need? And how might, my particular group's expertise or just sort of, our passion to be involved in some way, how might that, plug into that? Yeah, and it's possible that, these do exist, but sort of just making folks aware of that amid the sort of the noise of all the other things that, right, vie for one's attention and at this stage of sort of trying to start up a research group. So I think it would be helpful, I guess, just speaking for myself, for me, just even to know, okay, what website could I go to where sort of I could find someone, who should I talk to if I was interested in being involved a bit more?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, and one sorry, I was just gonna, one thing that just pops into my head, and also, feel free to sort of, I think, although, assistant professors, we have this, the stresses that come with being an assistant professor and trying to start up a research group. I do think that many would probably, at least at Berkeley, I think at Berkeley, would probably be interested in getting involved if somebody reached out to them in some way. They might be looking for opportunities, but like I said, we don't know where to begin, and it's just sort of this, huge thing that, okay, one more thing that we, to have to try to build up from scratch. But actually, we don't need to build up from scratch because there are so many other resources that we're just not aware of. So many other, folks who are really experts, in the outreach and educational programming that we could learn from and then serve in some way. And so, please do reach out to us.
Yeah, reaching out directly. And just, I've said this every time I've been on a CEO meeting, but Science at Cal is creating a BI, a broadening impacts and broadening participation database for all of the UC Berkeley community. So exactly what you're talking about, Kwabina, is going to exist momentarily. Stay tuned. Maybe I'll give an entire CEO about what we're creating and how it will impact not just faculty, but programs across campus, and work with Kate's group and work with everyone to do exactly what you're talking about. So that's why I'm here. So I'm so excited that you're saying all of this.
Yeah. One question is, I maybe there was a table set up at this event, but I remember my first semester or maybe my second semester here, there was sort of a assistant professors, some sort of an orientation kind of thing, sort of, and anyway, and there were tables set up, you had like SPO, Sponsors Projects Office had a table, and, and maybe there were tables set up for outreach, but I just wasn't aware of them, but that might be a good place to sort of start to get people aware that, hey, here are the resources, if you did want to get involved, here are a few handouts, like, I have one here from SPO, so I know who to contact, but I don't have one for reaching out to folks to help with outreach or education programming. So that might be a good place to sort of get folks like assistant professors like me aware of what's out there.
Kate. Oh, you're on mute still, Kate.
Yeah, I'm really excited by this conversation, so I just wanted to jump in a little bit. But there is a real issue with, there are a lot of people working on campus in the area of broader impacts. But it's nobody's job at the moment to sort of help to integrate all the moving parts and to bring them together, and when and where faculty need them, to do their work or to enhance their work. So that I know the event you're talking about, the orientation event, what is mostly about the research infrastructure at campus. And my organization, the Berkeley Research Development Office, was there, and we provide broader impact services to faculty, as Ron had talked about, to help not only help them think through high impact, high quality, broader impacts activities that are well aligned with their research, but also not duplicate things that are going on campus already, to be able to say, oh, this could be a really good enhancement to this program that is already existing. You don't have to create all the infrastructure to get that program started or recruit the students to participate. You just apply your area of research to develop curriculum that's maybe appropriate to this age group. And that enhances both your broader impacts, the impacts that your research is making, but also a program that directly benefits populations we're serving on campus. So I think with what Dee is also striving to create here on campus, we're getting closer to that one-stop shop, if you will, for broader impacts. It's always going to be challenging because Berkeley is huge. It's just impossible every day to put your hands around what everybody is doing. And the minute you do, the program that was funded by a 3-year grant is no longer existing. And we're trying to get over that kind of stuff more as we go along by plugging people into existing programs, right? Rather than those that will just disappear after 3 years when the funding ends. So I hope I haven't gone on too long, but we are working on it. There are allies. I would like to just put it out there that if people, because of my involvement with CEO and also with the Berkeley Research Development Office, where I work with a lot of faculty on their broader impacts plans for their proposals, I'm always here and available and I can be reached. And I would be happy to funnel faculty. If there's, I don't know how many faculty are on this call, but I just want to make a pitch that I'm happy to provide the go-between for anybody who would like to know. If you have a question, I may not be able to answer it, but I probably know who can. So
I tell people to go find you all the time, Kate.
I'd be happy to serve that function. I am happy to serve that function.
And Deb.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah,
So,
thanks, Kate, for all that you do.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Deb.
So at the lab, the challenge is surprisingly the same. I mean,
Yeah.
throughout my entire time at the lab, there've been all these individual programs that have reached out to high school students, grade schools, judged at science fairs, done broad array of different things because there's lots of passionate people. Most of them were doing it because they were tied to a school because their kid went to that school or things like that, that actually got them involved in it. I think the huge development for us is really having faith and having someone who is sort of providing that center, where we can sort of bring together our efforts and think about how they coordinate, how they impact longer term. Because same as with campus, our big problem was that most of these programs were dependent on one person, and they lasted for a couple of years, until that person really ran out of steam, got on a big project that they couldn't do it anymore, or whatever. And I love that Faith is now here in the lab to coordinate these sort of things, because I'm hopeful it gives us more of a longevity and a relationship building instead of sort of angel flights in where we try to impact in small doses. and instead have a long sustained effort to impact. Because there's a massive level of interest across the lab to get involved, and without that center to work around like Faith, it's hard to get involved. I mean, we tried at one point as computing to reach out to all the local high schools and try to organize something, but you start out from not even knowing what they need, right? I mean, do you actually just need math tutors, or do you want speakers on science, right? I mean, anywhere in between. And trying to figure that out by reaching out to the individual schools we gave up. So I do think having this central effort where somebody is pulling all the threads together and thinking about it holistically is key. So thank you, Faith.
I know this whole time I've been like, I know Faith has something to say. But I'm going to actually shoot it over to Faith to ask some questions that have come in from the audience, and she can add her 2 cents too. Faith is doing some amazing things and helping to create that center at Berkeley Lab, and very successfully. So
thank you, and thanks, Deb. I definitely having something that's a centralized place does start to think about the sustainability of a program or an effort. You know, if it's I know everybody said Faith, but there's a whole team behind that, and definitely the Berkeley Lab employees have been supporting. So for us, there's about 200 active employees who support, you know, high school programs and going into classrooms and judging science fairs. So we have been able to be the conduit in which, either by providing the exact program that employees can interact with, or by saying, here's where, you know, I'm the direct contact if you need somebody, and I know who to point you in the direction of. So it's I think been helpful for the laboratory employees to be able to say that there is a space to go to. And in particular, as Deb talked about, lab leadership has supported that effort. So my team has a lot more visibility than it might have had in previous years, because not only is diversity, equity, and inclusion a big part of the laboratory now, but also what are we doing for the local community? And so you really have to think about that as an organization. Where's the visibility of those outreach efforts, and how much are they being supported in order to be sustained? It really starts at the top. In terms of, you all answered most of these questions that were coming in, great panelists who are also paying attention to the chat box. But I would say, I don't know if there was anything that was going to be asked. I think one of the first ones was, you know, are there specific, I guess, you know, we talked about what are some of the good things, but what are the things that you turned down? You know, we've talked about putting this together. You have limited time, you have, you know, you want people to reach out to you. What do you want to see in that first email when it comes in and someone says, I want you to be a part of this outreach effort? I think I'm going to go from the other side of, what would you look at and say, I can't do this, or I'm not going to do this right away? So I'll let that breathe for a second, but I'll start with Ron. You're already unmuted, so
I'll jump in on that one. I think, you know, when I get contacted, I'm looking for things where I can start to get to know someone and the barrier to entry is low. Because in the end, I want to work with people who I really like and who are fun. And so if I have to put in a huge amount of effort before I find out that people who are asking me to do something are fun to work with, I don't like to do it. So I want to start there. I want to start with people who I like to see that we're building a relationship over time that is respecting that I'm a researcher first and an outreach person second. And so when I work with people who starts emailing and saying, I'd like your students to come to my school 7 days next week, and they're not responsive when I say, I've told my students they can do this 1 day a month. They think, when they think I'm being unreasonable, then I turn it off. So you know, those are two of the things, but it really starts with people who think that there's a way that we could have fun together and who express their opportunity in that language.
Awesome. Yeah, passionate about what they're doing, but also I definitely think of respectful of, I try to go, how much time is needed? That's up front when we give those requests, and definitely saying this is second priority to actually getting the work done, because if you don't have work done, you have nothing to talk about, really. So that's a big piece of it.
But I think also, there are some things that I do now that are really big time commitments, but they started small. And so I think that's also a piece of it, is finding a way to build to a bigger project through baby steps.
Kwabina, if you want to add into
I don't know if
that.
I have anything to add to that. I feel like that's, yeah, it's covered everything I could think of, frankly.
Awesome. And Deb?
So I think since I have the advantage of being in a lab environment, there's sort of the opportunity. One of the things I always look at is whether there is someone else who would benefit more from the experience, and sort of have that be their, something they're passionate about, rather than just yet another thing that I'm trying to do. Because I find that the more that we build up a ton of us who are passionately working on different aspects, we build a culture of that. So I'm always looking for only taking on the places where I have a unique thing that really, it means it should be me, versus someone else. And if it could be handled by someone else, then I try and find somebody who will passionately get involved in it, and sort of use that as their first steps into sort of getting involved in these things. And I don't try to do everything.
Awesome. All right, any other questions from the chat box? I just want to see make sure we don't have or miss anybody else. I think I was trying to review everything that came in, and I think one was, have you all seen any big changes further down in K-12 and college education that have either been helpful to your efforts or inhibiting? Whether it appeared from working with students and their level of preparation, or working with educators. So have there been any things that have been helpful in working with students or inhibiting that you've seen in current trends with K-12 students and college students right now that would not prepare them for working with you?
So I put this in the chat, but I'll just repeat it here. I think the interest in data science and big data is, and the code phrase data literacy has really changed some of the ways that we're interacting with high school teachers and trying to bring things to their classroom. So using our observations, whether it's the ones we're making or NASA satellite remote sensing, which are also enormous data sets, in ways that we can bring that to students, has been changed some of the ways we think about our outreach.
Deb?
So I think that we're seeing just more awareness in the K-12 and in the college environments that, there really is a need to provide that supportive environment. And the more supported and sort of cohort that the students feel like they have, the better prepared they are to with some help, reach into these fields that maybe they would have felt otherwise weren't supportive of them. Because it really does take a village to move people. You can't just do it one by one. I mean, you can, but you're never going to get very far. We're too far behind. And I think that's one of the things. I think, in the same way that Ron's saying, the fact that, the climate change aspects are becoming more and more prevalent for everybody. You're noticing it as a 3-year-old, you're noticing it as an 8-year-old, you're noticing it no matter what age you are. It's been, I think that's useful for me in that, I mean, I work in a lot of topics in that area. And I think it makes it easier to relate to kids of all ages when I'm talking about some of the things we're trying to do to understand that change. It's made it easier because it is a subject they're already talking about.
Definitely life and health between climate change and public health. I would say epidemiology has become a big topic because it's in the public eye, and that translates over to what are we doing to prepare students to go into those fields because they're seeing it on the news and seeing it in their everyday life. How can we incorporate that? Kwabina, any advice for, making sure that teachers and students are prepared to work with you all? What do you see in terms of trends that are happening at the K-12 or college space that you'd like them to have when they're connecting?
Yeah, I don't know if I've been around long enough to sort of really have a good handle on trends. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have anything else really to add to what Ron and Deb have already commented on. Yeah, sorry.
No worries. I think D is just, we're going to pin you for a discussion in about 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, for sure. Looks like
Deb
Deb has
Can I
something
add
to
one
say.
more thing?
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think I guess I want to encourage the educators on the call that we are, at least at the lab, I mean, we're pretty interested in helping in any way we can. So don't assume that we actually know what makes sense to bring to your classroom. Help us to understand what makes sense to you as something we can bring. Too many of us are too long from when we used to be in the classroom and don't really know what would be best, because we're fairly willing to do anything that makes sense. It doesn't have to be give a science lecture. It can be a math tutor. It can be whatever makes sense and and is needed. Because for us, just even putting an example of what does a scientist look like in front of them is we hope of value.
Let me just follow up on that and say, when we first started going to classrooms, I thought we were going to go and we were going to teach science. And more than half the time, what teachers want us to do is tell the story of how we got to be where we are. So just the way Deb was saying, it's really just, scientists look like all kinds of strange creatures, and they're not your television fantasy.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ron and Deb, for that final note. Kwabina, if you wanted to say anything or.
Yeah, I was just just to sort of echo what you've already heard, but I look at you folks as the experts on sort of how to do this, and I'm happy to learn, right, and sort of see what is effective, how can how can my group sort of play a role, and so yeah, that's sort of what I would be looking for connecting with folks. Is just yeah, so for somebody who is is willing, we're willing to learn, and so somebody who's willing to teach us sort of how we can play a viable part.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists. I will echo those sentiments of getting feedback and surveys from teachers over this past year. They definitely want to hear the stories, and for you to turn the GoPro on or flip your camera and show the beakers in the lab. Those are the two main things that they want to see, the internal lab and to talk about how you became a scientist. That we've seen definitely from our interactions with students. And sometimes, what is your favorite color? They also ask that piece. But I want to thank our panelists, and Linda put a comment in the chat box of being mindful when coming up with ideas for broadening participation and making sure that you reach out early to avoid last minute ideas. So definitely agree with that. Thank you to our panelists for being a part of today's wonderful discussion and talking about broadening participation. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dee and Kate for last comments before we close out.
I have no comment. I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here, our panelists and our audience. So Kate.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that we are recording this and we will put it up on our YouTube video, and I will send that link to you when it's up. So if you like this and you think that there are colleagues of yours who could benefit, I mean, I've never been part of a discussion like this before at Berkeley. And I think this could be very useful to a lot of different types of people. So if there are colleagues that you have, or your young scientists in your labs, the grad students and postdocs in your lab that would get ideas about this, from this conversation, which I think is really very, very rich, then, please pass it along. This is CEO's resources are open to everybody. You don't have to be a member. You can go on our website and we have a lot of resources there. So I really encourage you to spread the word if you like this session. Thanks so much for attending and being part of this discussion.